Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
When you're designing an IoT project, you really need to have a lawyer involved, even at the design stage. And the example I'll give you is we had a startup that was doing a home automation system really focused on security. And what happened is they designed the system, came to us, and we said, you've got a major problem because this does not comply with privacy law. And they had to go back and substantially redesign the whole system before they could release it. So it's really important that you understand the framework within which you're operating at the beginning so you can take that into account for design decisions.
The business counterpart to IoT security is risk, loosely defined as probability times liability. The current narrative around liability is centered on privacy, but it turns out that laws, regulations, and cybersecurity in general are some of the elements in the IoT liability matrix. In this episode of the IoT Business Show, I speak with Mark Radcliffe about the current IoT legal framework and the potential liabilities to address early on in the IoT product development cycle.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is made possible by sales of my book, IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, and the IoT Inc. Certified IoT Professional, or ICIP, online training and certification program. Become a certified IoT professional by completing the program's 3 courses: ICIP Technology, ICIP Business, and ICIP Strategy and Digital Transformation. Details of which can be found at www.iot-inc.com. That's www.iot-inc.com. With me today on episode 42 is Mark Radcliffe. Mark is senior partner with DLA Piper, a global law firm with offices in more than 30 countries. He has over 30 years of experience in the Silicon Valley and is co-chair of the IoT group within the firm. And he's also advising startups and Global 50 companies on IoT issues. I read an article Mark wrote for CIO Review a little while back and thought he'd be a great guest to have on the show. Mark, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Bruce. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so tell me, what's been the latest IoT activity you've been up to lately?
So I've been dealing with IoT in the workplace, where people are basically putting IoT devices on people at construction sites and then taking the data for both safety and monitoring purposes. So that's the most recent IoT project I've been working on.
Oh, that's interesting. So is it kind of like just measuring where construction workers are going? Is it the equipment? Is it all of the above?
Well, it's a combination of measuring where they are. That's where it starts out. And then they're also, going to integrate it with sensors on the equipment so they can tell if people are moving too close to the equipment. That is probably going to be real time with the sensor network. But it has to wait for the equipment to be sensored up, so to speak. Right?
Yeah, digitized or so. Right. And is it just is it regular construction or is it a particular type of construction?
It's a regular construction, and actually I'm working with one of the investors who's an insurance company who's very interested in this product in order to cut down on accidents and make sure that they can find people if there's an accident, things like that. So.
No, it makes sense if they fall down like some sinkhole or something like that.
Or they get covered in rubble or something like that. So, yes.
Yeah, I guess that's not so funny. Well, tell me a little bit about yourself and your background in IoT.
So I've been practicing in Silicon Valley, as you mentioned, for over 30 years. I do a mix of work of what's called intellectual property licensing as well as corporate securities. And corporate securities, I only do venture financing. So I've got 5 companies being financed right now.
Oh, okay.
So I work with large companies and I work with small companies. IoT is covering the entire map. I have one company that is providing the backbone for the OnStar service for GM. And then I have another company that's providing middleware for the IoT space. And then I'm working with large companies like this insurance company that are either doing IoT projects or investing in IoT projects. So it's a very dynamic marketplace right now in Silicon Valley and actually throughout the world. The company on workplace monitoring is actually located on the East Coast.
Mm-hmm. Now, how long has there been an IoT practice within your firm?
Well, we officially spun it up last April, but we've been dealing with this for some time. I mean, IoT, the skeptics will say, well, it's just a combination of cloud and sensors. And I think there's certain.
We know better than that, though.
That's correct. There's a lot more to it. I mean, it's certainly the pieces are all out there, but putting the pieces together, and making them data driven, that is a very recent phenomenon. So, and as you can see from our website, we've had a number of webinars on this because it's a very interesting area, since it, both from a legal point of view and a business point of view. I think the most interesting IoT business model I've heard of is what's called tires as a service. So in other words, what you do is you take tires and you go to a fleet manager and you say to the fleet manager, gee, I'd really like to, provide you tires that you need, not just, sell them to you, but I'll put the sensors on them and I'll tell you when you need to change them. And, basically you won't have to pay attention to tires. And the great thing for the tire company is you've converted sort of a semi-commodity business into something that's a subscription model. It's a much tighter relationship with your customer. And, subscription models are what, Wall Street loves. So it's a win-win-win.
The reason I laughed, actually, I thought you said ties as a service. I mean, I've heard of tires as a service, and it's interesting because if you combine the tires as a service with GPS information, you can then map the quality of roads, for example. And actually, that's that type of digital exhaust, or in this case, I guess it's not. It'd be predefined, but it could be sold as sold to a completely different customer than you would really expect.
Yeah, well, this is before IoT, but we had a client probably 20 years ago who basically made software to manage inventory for used car parts stores. And what they discovered over time is that their database of what parts went on what automobiles is actually better than manufacturers.
Interesting.
And so they actually sold the information back to the manufacturers.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, and that's the interesting part. Like you said, it is combining technologies. I think from a technology point of view, I mean, there's a Chinese menu of technologies that we source from to make an IoT system, product, environment, whatever the case may be. But it's really then where it goes beyond that. And I think what we'll probably be talking about is going to be the information that you gather from all this, all these pieces of technology and what you do with them. And I think that is one dimension anyway. That is a big differentiator from what's been out there before.
Yes, I think the sheer volume of data and with the new tools that are available, machine learning and some of the other big data analytics, the ability to feed back into the system and improve the system is something that really is at a different level than anything in the past.
All right. Well, Silicon Valley, helping startups, helping big companies. What's something else that most people don't know about you?
Well, I love wine. Many people know that, but few people know that I actually made my own wine for a couple of years.
Ah, okay. And is that something you do with your own grapes, or are you growing grapes? It's actually interesting because I live in a suburb of the San Francisco Silicon Valley area, but one house that's maybe 2 blocks from our house, 3 blocks from our house, they actually use their front yard to grow grapes. And they actually have this really small mini vineyard, but apparently, because I know someone who knows them, we're in a neighborhood, they can produce a few cases a year just from the plants that are they're actually growing in their front lawn. Are you doing something like that, or are you actually buying the grapes?
No such luck. No,
No,
I actually buy the grapes from vineyards up in Sonoma. I actually went to a place called Crushpad, which sadly went into bankruptcy a couple years ago. But they provided a complete sort of winery as a service approach,
Okay.
where they bought the grapes for you. They had somebody do the processing of the grapes. They did the processing according to a form that you filled out, about 30-page form, and
Oh, geez.
you got wine at the end of it. And it's actually very good wine. So I'm quite proud of that. Although I'm very sorry that Crushpad went away, because it's tough to do it all on your own. You need a lot of equipment, and the old saw about how do you make a small fortune in the wine business, start with a large fortune, is is absolutely true. I've seen friends who've decided they want the wine country lifestyle,
Yes.
and it
Yes.
turns out the wine country lifestyle is not a retirement lifestyle. You have to actually go out and work, and it's tough. So
Yeah, no, that's true. And did you have any wine that outlived the company?
yeah, I think the wine that people tried, they've told me it's very good, and I drink it myself, so it is pretty good. I actually got they did it by the barrel, which is about 24 cases.
Ah,
So I did it for about 4 years, and I still have some of the wine, but we drank a lot of it. So I guess that indicates that it was of good quality.
yeah, for sure, for sure. All right, well, let's tip into IoT, and I guess I want to start with a softball here. I mean, or maybe it's not a softball, but I think just a bit of exploratory question. What are the basic legal issues that managers should be, if they're planning an IoT business, what are the basic legal issues that they should be aware of? Not necessarily act on, but at least, but at least be aware of in the context of their business.
Well, I think there are a couple of them, and some of these are in the CIO magazine article you mentioned. So
Hmm.
first of all, cybersecurity. I think everybody pretty much understands that's going to be
Sure.
critical. Privacy, that can it's dependent on the product. For example, if you're making a product for home security, one of our clients did
Hmm.
that. Privacy and how you deal with privacy is very important. Or if you're making something for the automotive industry, privacy is very important.
Hmm.
If you're making just a lathe that's going to go in a factory, probably less important. But there was a recent New York Times article where a major manufacturer said, "We're going to personalize the factory floor. We're going to have lathes that identify the person who walks up to them. They're going to adjust height and all this other stuff." Well, that's great, and I think that is probably the future. But you've now converted sort of generic data that is about who's using the lathe and things like that is not really bound by any regulatory regime into what's called personally identifiable information. So now you know
Right.
which person was at the lathe, which times, what he was doing. Now that's a whole different regulatory regime. So,
Yeah.
and that goes to a point that I'll make in a minute about how important it is to understand the framework early on in the design process. But just to finish up on the other issues you should be
Hmm.
thinking about is you should also think about data and who's going to own the data, who's going to be able to use it. And I think we're going to discuss that a little bit more later because that's a very
Yep.
murky area. Software licensing is important, and finally regulatory. I mean, particularly if you're, for example, the automotive industry or the health industry, there's a whole regulatory framework there that you need to think about. And so those are sort of the big issues. And of course, liability is important too. And that will vary depending on, which industry you're in.
Now, the regulatory, I mean, let's dig into this a little bit. When you say regulatory, do you mean just the laws with respect to particular industries or as they pertain to IoT within those industries? If you know what I mean,
Yes.
like the difference being, is it related to IoT or does IoT fit into the existing legal framework?
Well, the problem is it doesn't fit very well within the current legal framework in many
Exactly.
situations. A classic example is the automotive industry. And, in the last 2 months, we've seen a demonstration of the complexity that I think we're going to see here. So the automotive industry is regulated at a number of levels. There's actually a global treaty about drivers and driving and liability, although it's pretty flexible. And then
Mm-hmm.
the federal government, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, imposed something called the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. And then each state determines who's a driver and what liability the driver has. And those vary dramatically from state to state. In one state, for example, a driver has to have one hand on the wheel. And so now how do you sort of fit a truly autonomous car into that? Well, it's not that simple. We just had in early February, the National Highway Transport Safety Administration gave a 22-page response to Google, who said, we're building a totally autonomous car. Here's all, we'd like you to consider our autonomous driving system, their, SDS, the driver.
Right.
And
then, I read about that. Yeah.
And then the question is, okay, so what does that really mean? Because there are all sorts of things that assumes the driver's a human being. Well, if in an autonomous car, there's supposed to be a manual, for example, there's a requirement for a manual brake. Well, how do you meet that requirement? And, and just to give you an example of the challenges faced, at least the NHTSA seemed to indicate that they'd be okay with having an autonomous car where the driver was considered to be the computer, the system.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, the state of California put out their regs for autonomous cars, and they're requiring the licensed driver, human being, be in the car at all times. Now, those are draft regs, but the point is, I think you're beginning to see the complexity of fitting, IoT, particularly autonomous cars, into the regulatory framework. Not saying that it's impossible. I mean, we've seen, any number of, technology, advances being fit into the automotive regulatory framework, everything from lane keeping software to software that maintains your speed. But, for an autonomous vehicle, there's going to be a bunch of issues that are going to come up, not on the regulatory side. And then, of course, there's the liability side. If if an autonomous vehicle is in an accident, who is responsible? Is it the person sitting in the car? Is it the the people who made the software? Is it the car manufacturer? If that's different from the people who made the software, and so those are all issues which are open and which going to need work within the context of these regulations in order to get the appropriate answers. And just remember, you're talking about not just the federal government, that's the NHTSA, but you're also talking about each state, and states are very jealous of their authority to, to basically regulate driving.
Yeah, now this is going to show my ignorance a little bit, but I'm just thinking ahead, and I'm thinking, okay, an IoT car is a great example, and there will be many others. How are regulations laws? I mean, how are they changed? What's the process for change a federal regulation or a state-based, here in the U.S. anyway, a state-based regulation? What has to happen?
Well, that's actually a very important distinction. So laws are the actual legal instruments that are passed by a legislature or by the federal Congress. Regulations are generally passed by administrative agencies to interpret those laws. Now, sometimes the laws refer very broadly to the administrative agency. Sometimes the laws are quite specific, and maybe you get an extra level of detail in the regulations. But regulations are things that are once again that are managed by the administrative agencies, but they can't go beyond the scope of the laws. So, for example, there may be things that Congress has passed in the Federal Vehicle Safety Act that really can't be modified by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They have to be modified by Congress. Certainly on the state side, the tendency is you have a statute which determines who is a driver, and that's passed by the state legislature. There may be some regulatory interpretations. That's what's happening in California, but you can't go beyond what the state legislature did. And the state of California actually passed a statute a couple of years ago saying, here's the framework for autonomous cars. Now, state agency, DMV, you go out and get more detail. And so they published regulations for essentially test vehicles. Now they publish draft regulations. They're holding hearings for actual, vehicles that are on the roads in a regular fashion, not in a test fashion.
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, you're saying there is a little bit of leeway within the regulatory bodies to make modifications to adapt to technology, maybe to adapt to their local state constituents. However, it's maybe not. Well, it depends on how the laws are written. However, in some cases, they're bound by the law, and to actually make changes, they're going to have to change the law and go even beyond just, working with the regulatory bodies that are appointed.
Yes, you've got it correct. And once again, the challenge, particularly in, for example, the automotive area, and this is a number of areas in the U.S. because we have a federal system, you have a federal level of regulation, once again implemented through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and then you have a state level. And the state level can differ. So, for example, back in 2006, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration did not require side airbags. Nonetheless, there was an accident in Texas where the airbags did not deploy properly, and the state court found in that case General Motors liable for that, even though they were not required by the NHTSA regulations. And so the NHTSA regulations can be thought of as sort of a floor of safety, and states can go beyond that either through their own statutes or a court-made law. And I guess we should mention that, particularly in the liability field, most of the rules are set up in courts. In other words, the courts make decisions, and that becomes precedent, and then further decisions rely upon them.
And now, but that's not. Is that the process of changing law then?
No, the process of change. So you change the law through the legislature. But for things like tort liability, if your automobile hits somebody else, most of that is what's called judge-made law. In other words, the state legislature may have imposed certain limits, for example, caps on pain and suffering damages. But by and large, the degree of liability you have in a car accident is governed by what happens in the courts. There's no statute, it's either the federal or the state level to manage that.
Okay. Well, I'm just thinking about this from the perspective of our listeners, and they're inventing IoT products in many cases, or components of IoT products. And I guess thinking ahead, if they're going to change the rules, break the rules, they need to consider, how these rules are going to change to accommodate their new invention. Now, we've been talking automotive space, which I think is, I think the two cases you just brought up about the federal law identifying a driver, actually recognizing that a driver can be a machine or a system, and in the California law where it requires actually a person in there with a license. I think they even need maybe a steering wheel. I can't remember. But there'd be other industries as well. I mean, one that comes to mind would be the medical industry, IoT medical devices. Are there what other ones are we kind of affecting, or is it kind of everything?
Well, so I think this goes back to a point I touched on earlier, but I think it's very important to make, which is when you're designing an IoT project, you really need to have a lawyer involved, even at the design stage. And the example I'll give you is we had a startup that was doing a home automation system, really focused on security. And what happened is they designed the system, it was fine from an engineering point of view, came to us, and we said, you've got a major problem because this does not comply with privacy laws. And they had to go back and substantially redesign the whole system before they could release it. And so it's really important that you understand the framework within which you're operating at the beginning so you can take that into account for design decisions. the example I mentioned earlier was the person, the company that said, we're going to make a lathe that is personalized where you walk up to it. Well, suddenly, by doing that, you're in a different set of regulations. But to your point, yeah, you're probably, there are some industries where this may not have as much of an effect. For example, if you're working on the factory floor, if you're not personalizing it so you can tell who is at what place at what time, that's pretty much wide open. Healthcare, as you know, is a very regulated area, has its own separate privacy law called HIPAA. And so you have to think very carefully about how you design, various products for that industry so you can fit into it. Because the problem is and this is a problem also in the energy industry, these people in the energy industry in particular are very, very focused on reliability. And so, I've worked with a lot of companies in the clean tech space, and they say, "Oh, we got this great invention. It's going to make it this, electricity delivery this much more efficient." They take it, they take it to the large utility companies and say, "Well, have you tested it for 2 years?" Yeah, it's like it's a very, very different mindset. And so I think as people think about this, and I think in the case of IoT in particular, where you're talking about infrastructure projects, which may be in place for a long time, you really need to think about how are you going to deal with this in the future. One example would be that, for example, Airbus, not necessarily an IoT, but says they actually prefer to have their third-party suppliers give them, provide the software for their components in an open source way, which means the source code's available. And the reason is they said, look, when we are making a plane from design to the last plane in service, it's 40 years. So it's very difficult to find even proprietary companies that are going to be around that long.
Sure.
So as you think about your product and what industry you're planning to market it to, you need to think about their issues, and you need to think, and frankly, if you get built into infrastructure, that's great because that's like an annuity. But you need to think about how how the players in the industry are going to view about integrating this into their products.
No, that's an interesting point. I mean, I promote security by design, and you're, to a certain extent, what you're promoting is law by design, in the sense of, before you go too much further beyond the initial design, pass it by someone that can tell you the legal ramifications for it. And now I'm thinking practically. So I've worked for startups. I've worked for larger companies. In larger companies, we had law firms that were on retainer, and they had a whole bunch of different skill sets within the law firms themselves. When I worked with smaller companies, or CEO of some startups, we had some relatively smaller law firms. So that may have just had a couple lawyers there. Now, so what's the best practice here? I mean, is it something you can just go to your general practitioner and get a lay of the land, and they can maybe point you, if necessary, somewhere else, or are listeners actually going to have to go to a law firm initially that is focused on the law around IoT?
So, first of all, I think you need to decide which market you're attacking and decide how regulatory intensive it is. But I think if you're doing anything in the automotive industry or in many of the IoT industries, I think you need to go to a law firm that has an IoT practice. And although we were the first, now there are a couple more, but because the combination of skill sets you need is quite broad. And I mean, for example, even though I'm the chair of the IoT practice, I would never give somebody advice on cybersecurity except to say, talk to my colleague over here. So so the skill sets you need in a traditional IoT product, or potential need, I would say, are cybersecurity, privacy, software licensing, sort of data ownership and use, and then potentially regulatory. And those are, once again, you can find those in law firms, but you got to find the right law firm, because a general practitioner, even though I'm a specialist, and I've been doing this for 30 years, I would not want to be advising somebody on cybersecurity. And once you make some of these design decisions, it's very difficult to go back from them.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. And again, things have to be practical also.
Yeah, yeah.
For a startup, they can't necessarily afford one of these, one of the few IoT security legal firms in the country, but at least what they could do is run it by their attorney and then get advice as to, yeah, I don't think, again, my experience also with attorneys is they're not going to take on any extra liability if they don't have the knowledge. So if you're going to say to them, will you guarantee we're good with our cybersecurity, our privacy, our data usage, unless they're pretty confident, they're not going to say yes, right?
Well, you certainly hope that. And I think attorneys who have been around a while understand their limits. But I will take issue a little bit with your idea that you can't go to the IoT law firms. I mean, we have a very robust um, startup practice. I work with about 50 startups at any one time.
Okay.
If you're serious about this, and frankly, if you're going to get funded by either traditional VCs or corporate VCs, they're going to want to understand what you've done in these areas. So you may actually not be doing yourself a favor if you don't think these through, because I work on both the company side, and that's the side I prefer to, and on the investor side. And I can tell you, the investors are asking very tough questions about, so what are you doing about cybersecurity? What are you doing about privacy? What are you doing about these issues? And they may choose not to invest or to impose a lot of additional obligations on you if you're not thinking these through. And so and so I think you'll find, that frankly, most, at least in Silicon Valley, most of the law firms representing startups are of a decent size, and some will have IoT practice, some may not. But I think you certainly can find companies if and I represent a number of startups who are IoT focused and who are, some of them are struggling with financing, some have got financing. So, so I think you just need to find a law that has both the startup mindset as well as this IoT experience. So.
What type of budget then should startups be putting away, or it might be in the due diligence process too? But what type of budget should startups be putting away to have this legal by design?
That's a really tough question to answer because it varies dramatically from like the automotive industry or healthcare to, so the people are doing stuff. There's, for example, a company is doing IoT automation of the factory floor. Unfortunately, I have to say it depends.
Let's use an example though. For example, let's say it's a home appliance. I have a dryer, an IoT dryer that I'm developing, and I want to understand, if I'm going to step on any legal toes.
For something like that, that's probably, sub 10,000, because you want to look at cybersecurity, you want to look at privacy. It depends on how you implement stuff. If you anonymize the information, well, then you're out of the various regulatory regimes. And it also depends on where you want to sell it. I mean, the regulatory regimes in the U.S. are quite different from overseas. And, we just saw the big blow up between the European Union and the U.S. When the European Union, they had a system of, basically working with European Union data in the U.S. through a certification program, which after 15 years was overturned by the European Union. And the good news is they've agreed to a new program like that. But, in the interim, so you just have, part of it will depend on what your market is, because the rules in France are different from Germany, are different from the U.S., are different from China.
Yeah, your market and your geography that you'd be selling in. But I think that helps. I think that helps, in terms of just scoping things as opposed to being, completely abstract. And what's interesting here, and I think the other point is, if you're going to be in an infrastructure, and I guess I wouldn't say automobiles are infrastructure, but if you're going to be in automobiles or you're going to be in something that's infrastructure based, then you probably are going to be in industries that are more highly regulated, and therefore you may require a little bit more advice. Is that kind of is that a good takeaway?
Yeah, that's a good takeaway. And also, some of the decisions you make early on may reduce the amount of advice you get. So if you ensure that the information you get is not what's called personally identifiable information, in other words, it's not tagged to a particular individual, well, then you free yourself from a lot of regulatory regimes.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good advice. PII information, just using or capturing that, or just keeping it in that form. But okay, it's interesting because I've been covering both security and privacy, which are two different things. And generally, when we're talking about legal issues, we're talking about privacy. But you've indicated cybersecurity, privacy, data usage. Privacy, data usage. Well, I guess maybe just take us through the differences, because I could see privacy and data usage being pretty similar, although maybe I'm wrong, and cybersecurity being something different. But let's start with cybersecurity. What are the legal issues with respect to cybersecurity that are independent of privacy?
So cybersecurity, a lot depends on what is right now sort of an evolving standard of liability for protecting information and protecting and making sure that things operate the way you expect them to. So, one question would be, what's the liability of a car manufacturer if, the entertainment system they put in the car allows it to be hacked and somebody to accelerate a car? Okay, so that's not private information. That's pure cybersecurity, right? So that's a very different issue than privacy.
No, but why is it? But explain, why is it different than privacy again?
Well, because in the case I discussed, which is an
entertainment system.
Entertainment system put into an automobile. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a hole in the security, so so somebody remotely takes control of the car and crashes it.
Okay.
Doesn't make a difference who's in the car, right? It's just
right.
So
got it. Okay, no, that's a good point. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that would be one example, and then also I think what practices are you using to maintain security? Because one thing about cybersecurity is I think everybody can agree is it's not a point solution. You need to have a way of upgrading it over time because the threats will change over time. Absolutely. And so have you done that, or have you tried to make it a closed system? Have you, for example, there was a recent report by OpenDNS about some of the problems in cybersecurity and in IoT, particularly simple things like the Heartbleed problem with OpenSSL, right? Where people have not fixed it. So it's not just you've designed the system, but have you implemented an updating regime, particularly for open source components, which may be part of your larger system. So that would that's an example of cybersecurity. And so, as you said, there is this overlap with privacy, because when people say cybersecurity, they generally think of somebody breached, data breach into somebody's database. Right. But there's obviously other forms of cybersecurity.
So let me kind of just put a finer point on that. So cybersecurity obviously has been around for a long time. I mean, what's different in IoT would be the data in motion. I'm supposing. So we have data at rest, and if we want to use that entertainment system at some point, potentially the settings and the presets were stored somewhere in the cloud, in the public cloud, which means it's some cloud, some server farm that's in some building data warehouse in Nebraska. I don't know, whatever, but it's sitting there, and I would assume once it's sitting there, then the same cybersecurity liabilities for it, they're the same as the liabilities for wherever the source of the information is. So is that a good way to break it? Then what we're really talking about, if we're talking about IoT, that's different, is the data that's in motion. So the data that's being communicated, that's being transferred potentially from, in the case that we're just using here, from the automobile to that Nebraskan data warehouse. Is that then what, if we narrow it down a little bit more, is that what we're talking about?
No, I think it's broader than that, because the thing about IoT, particularly I would say operational IoT, not something that's just receiving signals, is that it might, somebody might be able to take control of the actual car, or let's say you've got a robot on a factory floor. If it's hackable, somebody could take control of it remotely and then cause it to go berserk.
Right.
And then if you haven't put in place an appropriate level of security, then you could be liable for making it vulnerable to that hacking. That would be the situation.
Yeah, no, and I think I'm thinking about it again through a privacy lens, but really maybe the operative word here, for the newbie is to think liability versus privacy. Liability is what we've been talking about on the cybersecurity side, which is something that that IoT opens up that hasn't been necessarily exposed in the past, and in privacy being what we'll talk about in a minute, which is more the dialogue, I suppose. But I guess, yeah, this is interesting because we're teasing apart the two issues, and one is more focused on liability, and then we'll get into this one. And again, I'm generalizing, but one is more focused on liability, and then the other set, what we'll talk about, is on privacy. Is that a good way to kind of compartmentalize it?
Well, I think there's liability on both sides of the fence. I think the question is, what is the basis of liability? And so,
okay,
on the first side of the fence, there's liability for, I guess, unanticipated operations of the equipment, right? For the controlled equipment, because now you're in a situation. So, in the past, if we, go back a couple of years, if the car manufacturer puts in place, for example, a gas tank, right, that's located on the side. This is an actual case. A series of collisions, even though the car manufacturer was able to show that overall the truck was safer than other trucks, still they were found liable for putting the gas tank on the side of the car. Okay. So there's that type of liability for personal injury and property damage. And then the privacy, there's liability for breaching, for not putting in place appropriate measures for privacy, and then the results of that, people getting credit cards in your name and all that other stuff. So there's liability on both sides, but the liability arises in different ways, I guess is the way to put it.
Got it. No, okay. Now I'm kind of getting it. And just by the way, you're kind of freaking me out, but let's dig into it a little bit more. Let's talk about privacy and data usage. I mean, generally the narrative is around data ownership, but maybe scope it out a little broader than that with respect to privacy and data usage with respect to IoT.
Yeah. So once again, I see this as an overlap, just as we had an overlap between privacy and cybersecurity. There's an overlap between privacy and data. And so,
yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
And so, privacy is kind of a form of data, but there's a much bigger world of data out there, which has nothing to do with privacy. Privacy, I think most of us think about privacy as something where you can attach information to a particular individual, right? So
back to the PII again.
Right, back to the PII again, right. But there's this much bigger world of data, which, for example, if your car is on a road and it's reporting through GPS, if it hits a pothole, where's that pothole? That's a piece of data. It's not PII, but it's a piece of data that could be very valuable. There's the Google Maps, right? And, so that type of data is not personally identifiable information, but it's very valuable data, or data about, I was at a big conference in Barcelona called the IoT World Solution Congress, and anybody who's serious about this industry, I suggest they think about it. It's put on by the same people as Mobile World Congress, and they had 4,000 people there for the first one. But they had, for example, GE was talking about their program for wind turbines, where they essentially connect wind turbines in real time and to make them more efficient. So you have a wind turbine that basically, maybe it's on the east and there's a gust of wind that comes in. And so the wind turbine senses the gust of wind, it adjusts, and then it sends a signal to all the other wind turbines. So they're already adjusted by the time the gust gets to them. Okay. And so that's an example of data, not personally identifiable information, but that's important data. And then there's, the question of data in the context of, health. So if you put, for example, let's say that you have a diabetes monitor, okay? So it's sending out a signal as to what your insulin level is, or maybe blood sugar. So the question is, who owns that data? Is it the person who manufactured the equipment? Is it your doctor, your insurance plan, or you? And the answer to that is nobody quite knows, because data fits in this sort of murky area of intellectual property, where it's structured data, like data in database is protected, but it's the structure that's protected, not the raw data. So that's kind of a jump ball. And so I tend to, when I talk with my clients about this, I say, look, don't think of data in terms of ownership, because that's difficult to understand what that means, and maybe nothing, frankly, from a legal point of view. Think about it as to how you're going to use it. So what you should do is you should put the rights in the contract as what you want. It's really going to be very contractually oriented. And let me give you an example of why it's important to think about this in advance. So I, for example, have an insurance client, and the insurance client insures various types of industrial equipment. So they're very interested in having sensors on the industrial equipment telling them, is it heating up? What's the pressure? Those sorts of things. Well, so they went to like 15 different sensor manufacturers who were all going out there into the market and censoring up all these pieces of industrial equipment. And it was a completely chaotic as to what approach people would take. Sometimes people said, the sensor manufacturer said they own the data. Why a customer would agree with that, I don't know. Other times the sensor manufacturer said, no, you, the owner of the equipment, owns the data. In which case the insurance company said, nice to know you, but we're not that interested. And then sometimes they say, we, the sensor manufacturer, own it, but we can only use it for internal purposes, whatever the heck that means. And sometimes they didn't even address it. So here's this, insurance company that wants to aggregate data from a bunch of different sensor platforms so they can monitor this equipment and even provide, if they can monitor it, they'll have a better, they won't just have sort of like average life expectancies things. They can actually monitor their particular piece of equipment and probably write you a cheaper policy. Well, but they're kind of, they're sort of scratching their head because they've got all these different approaches, which, means that they can't really aggregate the data. They can only get the data from certain platforms. So if you're a sensor company and, part of your business model, which I hope it should be, is you're going to monetize the data, you need to make sure that you have the right to monetize the data. You can't, if you're silent on it, then you're probably going to get a, thanks, but no thanks from the people you're trying to sell it to. I mean, I have, for example, an agricultural company that is, whose business model is data as a service, because they're sitting in the middle of, between the farmers, the equipment suppliers, the fertilizer suppliers, all these people that, basically want to get data from the farmers so they can improve their products. And they're basically going to sit in the middle and provide they're going to be Switzerland and provide, this, the information to people. So, so it's important to think ahead as to what your business model is and what your where you're going to get your value. And frankly, in many cases, the value may be more in the data than it is in the product itself. I mean, just to give you an example, there was a release in the Oracle versus Google case, where Oracle said that Google had made $31 billion from Android, of which $22 billion was profit. Now, that was not because they were selling Android. That's all the ancillary services they built around it. So you can, and so,
like data. Yep. No, so I mean, okay, so just to be clear here, we were talking about cybersecurity, and the issue of liability was a big one. We kind of popped over privacy. I'm going to want to go back there, and now we're into data usage. But I just want to pick up on a couple things. The first thing is, it almost what you're saying is that data usage is defined by contract, not so much by law. And correct me where I'm wrong, because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of laws that are out there that are covering this kind of thing. So it sounds like you're saying if you anticipate that you're going to be utilizing the data, you need to have your customer agree to that, and that's going to be in the form of a contract. Am I simplifying it? Am I getting it right?
No, I think you've got it right. I will say just footnote, and we'll discuss this in a minute, is certain types of data will be subject to other regulatory regimes, like health data. The example I gave of
HIPAA,
the monitoring for the diabetes monitor, and then certain types of personal identifiable information. But if we're talking just raw data, like coming off a sensor about, where the performance of an oil well. I'm dealing with an oil
Mm-hmm.
well, uh, basically monitoring group, and they're basically moving their data to the cloud. And question is, can they do it, and what can they do with it? So,
Okay, and so that's around the idea of the concept of data usage. And again, I think what you're saying is that's more of a contractual issue. You just need to make sure that you do establish that contract in whatever form that may be, with you being the supplier and you being the vendor and your customer.
that's correct. And
Okay.
probably you want to get, unless your crystal ball is a lot clearer than I think most of crystal balls, you probably want to get the broadest rights you can to use the data, right? Because that's going to help you, in your business model, because I think data is going to become a very important way of monetizing these, your IoT product and service.
Yeah, but then when you have multiple levels, and I guess that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. When you have multiple levels of usage, and you use the heart rate,
Yeah.
the pacemakers. I think that was your example,
Or diabetes monitor,
or diabetes monitor.
yeah,
Yeah,
right, yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, you said it, and I'll ask it again, and I guess maybe you answered it, but do I own that data? Does the health provider own that data? Does the supplier of of diabetes pump own that data? And I guess you're saying everyone just sort of says they own it by contract, and then they're okay, or how does that kind of shake out?
Well, somebody's going to end up having, and so first of all, I think data ownership remains a sort of murky concept. The question is, what rights do you have to use it?
Okay, so it's
Yeah,
use versus ownership. Okay,
and
that's fair.
who has those rights? And that's going to be established by contract. But there's going to be, in that particular case, there's going to be the overlay of HIPAA. So even if, let's just say, the device manufacturer says, I own the data. Let's just use own for now as I have the right,
Yep.
use it as a proxy for I can use it any way I want. There's the regulatory over framework of HIPAA, which says, yeah, you may have the right to use it in any way you want, but you have to do it in compliance with HIPAA, because contractually
Sure.
you can't contract your way out of a regulatory regime in most cases.
Right, which takes us to the beginning of our
Right.
our discussion on the regulations and so forth. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's helpful. So yeah, that's a good point. Is so what is the wild west right now is who owns the data. However, you can contractually claim stake to using that data,
Yeah.
and that's what you want to do. And as you said, the best practice would be obviously to try to claim as wide a stake to that, or as wide a net to that not ownership, but usage as possible.
That's correct. I think usage, I continue to say usage really is pretty difficult to sort out what that means. Better to say you can use the term usage, but you can use the term ownership, but you better define it, because it really is very unclear what that means. So better to say here's what I can use it for than sort of rely on the term ownership.
No, I think that's very helpful.
Yep,
I think that's helpful because to a certain extent people throw their hands up and they go, oh, we don't know who owns it, but yeah, no, okay, we don't know who owns it, but now let's lay claim to who can use it. And as of right now, notwithstanding regulatory laws or regulations, it's not super clear in the law, so you can laying claim metaphorically by using some sort of a contractual mechanism, a contract of some sort or other.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, it's good. No, this is good to tease out the differences because obviously, when you have a bunch of techs talking about this, they conflate a lot of issues together, and it's useful to kind of separate them. Now, one of the ones that's tied very closely to security is privacy, and we haven't really got to that. But let's talk about the main. Can you maybe just give us the high level issues with respect to? We've talked about PII, right. And you said I guess the best practice is first thing is just you tell me. I mean, it's where is that when you say don't keep personally identifiable information? Does that mean in the database? Does that mean don't collect it in the first place? Maybe start there and then give us some more details.
Sure. the important thing here is to understand if you're in or out of the privacy regime. And what I was trying to say is, look, you could design your product in a way where you don't get personally identifiable information. So you're not able to connect, for example, let's use the lathe example, right? You're not able to connect who was at the lathe with, when the lathe was being operated by that person. And, so there is a product design or service design issue here. Once you are collecting information, which can be linked to a particular individual, then you get into kind of the world of privacy regulation, and that's a complex world. And we actually have a special group that deals with it. I'm not a member because it's not a core part of my practice. But let me give you sort of the top line issue. So the first thing is it is highly dependent in the United States based on industry. So unlike the European Union, which has a general set of laws regarding privacy, which covers the entire union, although they are implemented separately in each country and can be implemented differently within a range, the U.S. doesn't have a comprehensive set of statutes. So it is a complex mixture of federal, state, and even local rules. Okay, and so you need to understand what industry in. One of the few regimes which is pretty well defined and applies throughout the United States is HIPAA, which applies to healthcare information. So that is, if you're in the healthcare field, you need to understand what HIPAA is, and you need to either design your product to not come within the bounds of HIPAA, or understand what HIPAA is and make sure that it's HIPAA compliant, because that's one of those areas where if you try to sell in the healthcare industry and you're using private information in a way which tags HIPAA, unless you're HIPAA compliant, your market is zero. So you just got to be aware of that. If you're selling to hospitals and you've got something that's that needs to comply with HIPAA and it doesn't, you've got a problem.
Now, what about in the Google Oracle case where Android, I suppose, was collecting PII so they could do advertising, which I assume made up a majority of that revenue? How does that fit in? Is there something that we need to know about with respect to advertising? Is there?
Google Oracle is really over a different topic. It's focused entirely on whether or not Google violated copyright law by using certain
copyright
of Java. So it's not a privacy issue at all.
Okay.
But so going back to this complex metric,
the privacy regime. So that's an interesting concept. The first time I've heard it. So one privacy regime is in the area of healthcare. What are some other examples of privacy regimes then?
Well, there are privacy regimes which are state-oriented. Okay, so like the state of California has certain requirements on the use of personally identifiable information, which, for example, are very different from those in Texas. And then there are sort of weird outliers. So you'll be happy to know that the record of the videotapes that you rent is actually protected by federal law. And has a lot, and the reason for that sort of peculiar exception is a congressman got in trouble in the early 90s by renting porno tapes from a store, and so Congress decided this was a very important issue for many Americans, and so that's protected by federal law, whereas a lot of these regimes are state oriented. And there's actually a part of our website which goes into great detail on the regimes, not only in the United States but overseas. But it's a constantly evolving, particularly at the state level. It's constantly evolving because people are concerned about all the ways in which people's private information is being used and abused, and so that's a very dynamic area, particularly in the U.S. Once again, other places in the world, like Europe, have a very different regime. The European regime, for example, is much more of what's called an opt-in regime than an opt-out. So in the U.S., as you know, on most websites, you go and if you read the privacy policy, you have to actually check a box to opt out of it, right? In Europe, you have to check a box to permit them to use your private information. So,
Mm-hmm.
so there's sort of fundamental differences across the board there. And depending on where you want to sell your product and what industry is in, it's going to be subject to different regimes. So.
Okay, and again, I'm just trying to get my hand around regimes. So they're not really identifiable. I was thinking HIPAA was a regime and PII would be a regime, but that's maybe not the right way to look at it then?
Well, I think you've got to understand it's a little bit of a three-dimensional matrix. So it's basically, it's the industry you're in, so healthcare, or if you're
construction, let's use as an example.
Yeah, construction, probably nothing. No overall regime. Probably just a general regime. And then there's which jurisdiction you're in. So if you're in Europe, it's one single regime.
Second dimension.
Right. And then if you're in the U.S. And you're in construction, then it's probably state by state, and maybe even there may be even local regulations which apply. Probably not in construction, but in other things.
Still in dimension 2, okay.
So that's dimension 2, and then dimension 3 is sort of what are the consequences of a failure to comply, right? And it could be regulatory, in other words, the federal government could come and knock on your door, or it could be state agency, or it could be state government, or it could be you just get sued in court and you have to deal with the court system.
Okay, so it could be nothing, but then you could actually get sued, which is something different, I guess.
Right. I mean,
in this context.
Well, the difference is between a regulatory action where somebody, the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, comes to you and says your information handling practices are illegal, and I'm going to fine you $2 million, and that's generally right behind that is class action litigation, which says you violated the FTC rules, and you're going to pay lots of money to me. So those are the or there could be regulations where there's no government agency that's in charge, that is regulating them, and the only potential liability is through a court action. So there was there's a lawsuit filed last year. Wired magazine came out with a report of how they were able to hack into a particular car remotely.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then 2 months later, there's a class action litigation filed in San Francisco saying that particular manufacturer had not put enough cybersecurity in place. So even though nobody had hacked a real car in a real environment, this was just a test case, right? There's a class action that came along on that. Okay, and it's not because they violated a federal government regulation or this or that. It was because they hadn't put enough cybersecurity in it. So, anyway.
And I think that might have been related to your entertainment system example, anyway.
That's how they got in. And one of the problems is not necessarily cars so much, but many companies who are making industrial equipment are basically just sort of slapping internet connectivity on top of them without thinking about cybersecurity, and that means a big potential risk, because many industrial systems, like based on SCADA, they didn't assume there's any connectivity, right?
Right, and there wasn't. Yeah.
That's right, because there wasn't, right? So now, as you're connecting things, you need to think through what the consequences of that are.
Yeah. Yeah. No, Mark, this has been very useful to me as a legal neophyte, and I'm assuming most of my audience is also legal neophytes. I think you've made the point. This stuff kind of freaks you out if you're not aware of it. So I think, if nothing else, you made the point that, and I like it, this, the way I'm terming anyway, instead of security by design, legal by design is just make sure you do get some opinion. And it may just be as simple as, no, you're good, but just get some opinion to make sure that you're not going into these areas, these uncharted areas or chartered areas where you could maybe, trigger off some landmines that were unexpected. So thank you for that. I think it's been really helpful. If people want to find out a little bit more and dig into this, which I'm sure they will, where can people find out more about you and your company? How can they get a little bit more information?
So probably the best way is to go to our website, which is www.glapiper.com. So
okay, I'll put that in the show notes.
Right,
yep.
And we actually have an Internet of Things page there, which you can go to. It's probably best just to go on the website and search for Internet of Things. But we actually have a series of webinars which we've done. We did 3 last year. We've got our first one on eHealth is coming up, I think actually next week. And so, and we're going to be having a continuing series of these. You can go and listen to them. And the other thing you may want to consider is if there are particular topics you'd like to see, just send me an email at mark.radcliffe, RADCLIFFE, at DLApiper.com. Because, we're sort of laying out the program for this year. And, if there's a particular topic that you think would be of interest to a broad number of people, that, we'd be happy to consider it.
Excellent. Well, those were really useful resources. I will put all this information in the show analysis notes. I may also give you, I guess, a suggestion for a future topic. And with that, thank you. Thanks a lot for the discussion.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Great job, man.
Thanks a lot.
Great job. Yeah, no, that's good. That was really helpful to me to kind of tease apart some of these issues that I think that have been, when techies talk about it, they kind of conflate a lot of things together. So, that was helpful, definitely helpful for me. So I'm just assuming it's going to be as helpful for everyone listening.
Well, great. Thanks a lot. Well, I've worked in the open source field for a long time, and, and I don't know if you've seen those posts, but, the ones I love are IANAL, I'm not a lawyer. And then they go.
No, I haven't seen that.
They go and then describe the most complex, nuanced issues in copyright law with complete assurance. And so it's kind of, I'm used to that conflation, shall I say.
All right. So this is going to come out relatively quick. I'm guessing it's going to probably be coming out next week. So I'll let you know, and you might want to forward it on to your marketing people. I'll send you like a little graphic if you guys do social media.
We do.
And yeah. And I'm going to take a look at those webinars and let me think. I might, because I get a lot of feedback from this audience and from my website in general. So I'll also think about maybe some suggestions to give you guys some ideas of potential areas to dig in further.
That sounds great.
Okay. Talk to you later. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Okay. That was a good talk with Mark Radcliffe. This podcast goes vertical, deep diving into different topics each week. If you prefer a more horizontal and structured approach to learning IoT business and its orbiting technologies, check out my book IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, or become a certified IoT professional by completing the ICIP training and certification program. For details, just go to www.iot-inc.com. Also go to www.iot-inc.com for an analysis of this episode, links to things that were mentioned during the episode, and very importantly, the episode's PDF transcript. Just search for the name of the episode or the guest. If you're new to this podcast, subscribe. That way you'll get every week's episode delivered straight to your device. Or, if you've been listening for a while, there are 3 ways you can support the show. You can leave a rating or a review on iTunes. Just go to iot-inc.com/iTunes. It only takes 1 click to leave a rating, a little bit longer to leave a review. You can share it on social. I'm on LinkedIn, to a lesser extent on Twitter. And of course, you can support this show by buying my book, IoT Inc., or the ICIP training and certification program. It's how I pay the bills. Next week's episode is IoT Regulations and the Information Security Program with John Aspac of GDT. I hope you can join me then. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Till next week, may your path to IoT business be a legal one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.